Hi, for this tutorial we're going to make a timer in Pygame. Generally, timers in Pygame are pretty easy to do, but they can be a little bit finicky. So for this tutorial we're going to focus on one particular program that isolates the important part of it. Which basically just means that we have a black screen. If we press a button it becomes white for 2 seconds and then it goes back to black. Really exciting stuff. Before we get into the actual code, let's talk about the logic of timers. Because there's no easy inbuilt function in Pygame that waits a few seconds and then executes some code. That just doesn't exist. And instead we have to build our own timers from other tools in Pygame. And here's how that works. Once we initiate Pygame, a timer starts to run and counts up in milliseconds. And we can measure how much time has passed since that point, whenever we want and as many times as we want. And to turn that into a timer, we need to measure a single point once. I am going to call that one a static point. And then we have to continuously measure a point after that. And I'm going to call this point the current time. And the difference between our current time and our static point is the length of our timer. And all we really need is to run a function where we have current time minus our static time greater than the length of the timer that we want. So if I wanted a 2-second timer, we would need a line like current time minus static time is greater than 2000. And run whatever code you want after that. And it is quite important to have a greater than as opposed to an equal to sign, because we only measure the time on every single frame. We do not measure it every millisecond. If we have 60 frames per second, we only measure the time every 16 milliseconds. So it's very unlikely that we're going to be exactly on 2000 milliseconds ever. Instead, we probably end up with a value slightly higher or lower. So we have to use greater than or smaller than values for time. And that's the basic logic. When it comes down to it, it isn't actually that hard. So here's how I'm going to implement this in our code more specifically. Our timer is going to start running when we call pygame.init. And after that, I'm going to create 2 variables. One called current timer, and that one is measuring our time on every single frame. And then I have another variable that I call button press time. And this one is going to be our static time. And both of these start at 0. And then I also have some code to check for a button press. And only when a button is pressed will the button press time be updated. And that button press also changes the background color of the game to white. And then we will check on every cycle of the game loop if the difference between the 2 points is greater than 2000 milliseconds. And if it is, then we change the color of the background to black. And that's it. Now let's actually implement all of this. So I have already started with a very basic Pygame setup, so we're saving some time on writing. And just to go through it really fast, we start with importing Pygame and sys, then we initiate Pygame, then we create the main display surface object, so this is what the player sees in the end. And in our case, it's 800 by 800 pixels wide and pretty much nothing else. It doesn't even have a title yet. And then we create a clock to accurately measure our time. Then we come to our game loop. And the first thing we do is to check for input if the player has pressed the escape button. And if he did, then we end the game. Then this line draws the frame we have painted in the while loop. And then our clock measures the time accurately that we have 60 frames per second. So in the end, all that this is doing is to show us a black screen that is 800 by 800 pixels. So let's implement the timer then. The first thing we need is a variable that I'm going to call current time, and for now it's just going to be 0. So this is where we measure our time on every frame. And this we can do in the while loop with current time equals pygame.time.get ticks. And this gives us on what millisecond we are right now. Obviously we can't see this right now, but we could print it, for example. Print current time. And if I run the game now, we still can't see anything, but down here, we can see our numbers. And you can see here, they increased by 17 on every frame. Exactly the length of 1000 divided by 60. So that's the length of one of our frames. And the reason it doesn't start at 0 is because the program is loading a little bit. But it doesn't actually matter. And with that, we have our current time. Now we need to check if a button has pressed, then we want 1 point in time. So I'm going to create another variable that I have called button press time. And that one is also going to be 0 by default. But for this one, I'm only going to check it if a button was pressed. So first I need to add some code to check if a button was pressed, which we can do with if event.type equals pygame.keyDown, all in capital letters. So this just checks if any button has been pressed down. And if that is the case, then I want to take this variable and assign it the same as before, pygame.time.getTicks. And let's illustrate both of these. And I'm going to do this with an f string. So I'm going to print f, and then let me write current time is going to be our current time, and button press time is going to be our button press time. So what this line does is that it checks the current time and our button press time. Let me run the game now. But let me just press a button a couple of times. So right now we can see the first frame is going to be at about 1 second, and the button press time by default is 0. So this one is increasing, this one is static. But if we go down, so I press the first button at about 2 seconds, and that's also our current time. But now this one here remains static, whereas this one is increasing. And the difference here is going to be our timer later on. And if I go down further, when I have pressed the button a second time, at about 3.5 seconds. And that's the basic thing we need for a timer. So that's going to be our very basic setup. Next up, I want to change the color of the screen to white once a button has been pressed. So in the if statement where we check if the button was pressed, I add screen.fill, and now I need 3 values about the RGB values. And to get white, it's going to be 255, 255, and 255. Check out RGB values if you don't understand these numbers. So if I run the game now, and I press a button, then the screen is going to be white. But it's not going to change back at all. So we need to implement that. And here's how we actually create our timer. That we want to check our current time minus our button press time is greater than 2000. And if that is the case, screen_screen.fill is going back to 0, 0, and 0. And that literally is our entire timer. Oh, and I forgot the if. And now this should all be working. So I press it and I wait 2 seconds. Exactly. Now it goes back to black. And that really is all there is to a basic timer. And we can do this as many times as we want, and this keeps on working. And that's it. You can find the code on GitHub, and I hope this is helpful.